In this video, I'm going to talk about the many different functions of potassium. Let's talk about the functions of potassium, and then we'll get into like how our bodies regulate it. So like sodium, we talked about sodium last week. I did mention potassium a lot in that episode, and I'm going to mention sodium a lot in this episode. So if you haven't listened to the other one, the partner episode, please listen to it. I think it'll help you make more sense of this mineral. But potassium, it's an electrolyte just like sodium, but instead of being primarily outside of our cells, which is where sodium hangs out, it's primarily inside of our cells, 98% of it. And it's mostly in our skeletal tissue. I think it's like 98% is found in the skeletal muscle. Yeah. And there's a lot of potassium in our body. There's 1,755 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So it is one of our most abundant intracellular minerals in the adult human body. And just to give you context on like the concentration inside the cells versus outside, it's 30 times higher inside the cell than outside. And that's why blood work for potassium is not a great measurement. Because like I talked about in that first episode on mineral testing, our blood mineral levels are held inside such a tight range so that, our bodies are going to keep us safe and healthy. And if they start to get out of that range in the blood, it means that, they've been getting out of range for a long time inside our cells, especially a mineral like potassium, since most of it's found inside our cells. So by the time you see something like a low potassium show up on your blood work, you could have seen that on a hair test probably years ahead of time. And potassium is definitely one of the more notoriously difficult minerals to increase from a hair test, but that when we talk about how it's regulated, I think you'll understand why. So what do we use potassium for in the body? It's used for nerve and muscle activity, very important for contraction. That's why a lot of people struggle with muscle cramps when they have low potassium. It's also important for that intracellular fluid balance, which I talked about last week a lot with sodium. Because like a lot of people will get fluid retention when they increase their sodium intake, and it's typically because they don't have enough potassium. So that sodium potassium ratio is very important to keep our intracellular fluid in balance and not outside the cells, which would be fluid retention. We also use potassium to transport nutrients into the cell like glucose and thyroid hormone, and it reduces blood pressure. This is a big topic that I dug into in the sodium episode. So if you want to hear more about this, definitely go listen to that one. But when we increase potassium intake, it means that we have more sodium leaving the body through the urine. So the more sodium retention we have, typically that can impact your blood pressure. That's why increasing potassium intake reduces your blood pressure, because it helps sodium leave through the urine. Again, these two minerals work so closely together, and we want to make sure they're in balance. Potassium also reduces calcification. And I had someone asking, I put this in the bonus resources because I had someone in my Patreon asking about calcification on the kidneys, and I literally came across a study about that when I was researching for this episode. So it also reduces calcification. It's great for bone health. There's a good amount of research on how potassium can help retain calcium. It reduces how much calcium is excreted in the urine, and it can help protect against things like osteoporosis. And then blood sugar, it's huge for blood sugar balance. You heard me say it helps transport glucose inside the cell. That's huge. So it has like an insulin-like effect on our cells, and that helps us tolerate carbohydrates better. It also binds to glucose molecules so they can be stored as glycogen in the liver and muscle cells. And I think some people don't realize how important this is for blood sugar balance, because if we don't have enough glycogen stored in the liver and muscle cells, that's an extremely stressful situation for our body, because our bodies are always trying to keep our blood sugar tightly regulated to keep us alive. So potassium is very important for that. And so is thyroid hormone, but those two work very closely together. And then it's really important for digestive tract activity. I got a few questions about how potassium impacts constipation, because I can't tell you how many people have contacted me that have done my course, or clients I've worked with that have been like, wow, I increased my potassium intake and now I'm not constipated. Remember, it is important for muscle contraction. When we get higher low levels, that the messages that are being sent to our brain can get dysregulated. And so that can lead to issues with peristalsis, or like that movement contraction of our intestines. I definitely see it mostly with low levels. So if you have improved peristalsis, improved movement of your intestines, you're going to have more regular bowel movements. When that slows down, you're going to be constipated. Potassium also helps to pull water into the digestive tract, which is important for having regular bowel movements. And then low potassium diets have been linked with intestinal permeability, or leaky gut, as many people hear it called, which that can have a whole host of effects on like our gut bacteria. If we have overgrowth, if we have things like yeast growing, pathogens, parasites, things like that. And eventually that's going to affect our ability to break down our food and that peristalsis, that movement. So if we don't get enough potassium and then we have issues with our imbalances in our gut, that can also lead to more constipation. So that's a lot, right? Potassium does a lot of things. It's really cool. And it's one of those minerals that I don't recommend supplements. I just have people get it from food. And it's like you can make a little change in it. I've had people even just 1,000, 2,000 extra milligrams a day than what they were currently taking in. And they're like, oh, I'm having a bowel movement every day. Oh, I have better energy. I'm not having like a dip in the afternoon. I feel like you get a very quick return. And if any like energetic and time investment you put into it. Okay, so those are all the functions. Let's talk about how it's regulated, because again, potassium is one of those minerals that is so important. It's definitely the one that we take in like the largest amount. I mean, if you think about, we'll talk about the RDA, but it's like thousands of milligrams, which most minerals, it's like a much lower recommendation. But when it comes to potassium, what we're taking in is typically going to be excreted unless we're deficient. So our body is going to adjust based on our current potassium status. And all this is being regulated by our kidneys. So they're going to regulate that excretion of potassium just to maintain that homeostasis. Like I said, our bodies like to keep our blood levels very tight. And so if we increase our potassium intake, we'll excrete more in our urine. If we decrease our potassium intake, we'll excrete less. And most of the potassium that we're excreting is through urine, like 90%, only like 10% is through stool. Very little is lost through sweat. And because our kidneys are the main organs regulating this mineral, I do often get a lot of questions about like, well, what if is there any issues that someone could experience, like kidney issues if they're increasing their potassium intake? I mean, I think if you're doing it through food, the risk is very low, but I think that's a listener question at the end. So I'll do like a rapid fire of like situations where people like don't want to increase potassium intake, or like why someone may have a bad reaction to increasing their potassium intake. But for most people, if you're doing it with food and you have healthy kidney function, your body's going to adjust. So don't let that kind of fear-mongering scare you. I did a post on the RDAs a while back, and I talked about potassium because they like continuously lower the recommendation for that. And I just don't think it's serving our population, especially like the general population that's still eating like the standard American diet. I'm like, this is not fair for these people because they just keep lowering their salt intake, which leads to they're going to excrete more potassium. It's just like, it's going to lead to higher and higher blood pressure is a concern. And I talk more about that in the sodium episode, but it's like a frustrating thing for me. And I don't think people prioritize potassium rich foods enough. It's mostly going to be in fruits and vegetables, beans, stuff like that, cooked greens. And then you can get some from dairy as well. And then some from like meat, salmon. But a lot of it's in like fruits and veggies. And I think most people could do with an increase in those types of foods anyway. But a lot of people push back on that post saying like, well, people could have heart issues. People could be struggling with kidneys. And I'm like, okay, but for the general population, most people are going to benefit from more potassium-rich foods. If someone is supplementing with potassium, I think that's a different story because we absorb a lot of potassium from supplements. I was researching I made the potassium supplement resource for the Patreon members, and I was going through each of the common types and then how they're absorbed. I mean, potassium supplements are absorbed almost as well as the potassium from potatoes. Sometimes some forms of potassium are absorbed even better than the potassium in food. And you might hear that and think, oh, I'm going to like do a supplement instead. But I think that's when people could run into issues of overdoing potassium and potentially having problems from it. But if you're not on any medication, blood pressure meds, of course, if you take blood pressure medication and then you take a bunch of potassium, that could lead to really low blood pressure, like dangerously low, because potassium lowers our blood pressure. But if you're a healthy person and you're not taking medication, maybe you have blood pressure concerns, eating more potassium-rich foods would be really helpful. So there's just so much with misinformation out there with sodium and potassium and heart health and all that. Even like kidneys, I'm like, unless you have like end-stage kidney disease, your body can adjust potassium. So it's like a whole thing. But I know there's a lot of fear around it. I don't want you to fear it. I think if you focus on food, you're probably going to be okay, but just talk with your doctor to make sure. But yeah, most of our potassium's inside our skeletal muscle. When it comes to like, we're excreting it in our urine, like that, the main thing that's regulating it is our intake in our kidneys. But other hormones can impact potassium levels, like aldosterone. We talked about this a lot in the sodium episode. Your kidneys will eventually make this hormone aldosterone if salt intake is too low. Like if you're restricting salt, because they need to retain more salt or sodium. Your body wants to retain more sodium. So if we have salt restriction, we're going to have more aldosterone, and that's going to mean more sodium and less potassium. So we're going to excrete more potassium if we're holding on to more sodium. And then same thing with stress hormones. Like if we're releasing those stress hormones, aldosterone's also going to get released, which means we're going to increase that absorption of sodium or retention of sodium, and then we're going to increase the excretion of potassium. So like stress, lowering salt in your diet, those are also going to impact how much potassium you're retaining or how much you're going to get rid of. And then finally, insulin. And we'll talk about this more when we go through blood sugar, but insulin can help keep potassium inside the cells. And this is why a lot of people that struggle with type 2 diabetes and are not utilizing insulin or insulin resistance, maybe they don't know yet, they typically can end up with very low potassium levels. But yeah, potassium consumption basically is going to help minimize sodium retention, and it can help people handle higher amounts of salt. It can lower blood pressure. The more you take in, the more you're going to excrete unless you're super deficient. And yeah, that's pretty much it for how our kidneys and our hormones are regulating potassium. Oh, and I thought this was like a very interesting note. There's a study that shows with zero potassium intake, serum potassium, so like your blood levels, can reach deficient levels from 3 to 3.5 in about a week. But if someone increased their potassium intake to like 10 to 15,000 milligrams a day, which is a lot of potassium, it barely raised their potassium blood levels because your body, as you intake more, your kidney is going to excrete more in the urine. So your body will adjust to potassium intake. I think this is a huge part of why it's so hard to improve potassium levels on a hair test. But there's also a lot more that goes into that, like stress. We talked about aldosterone and stress hormones leading to more potassium excretion. If we don't fix our stress and how we're living our lives and our habits, then we're not going to increase our potassium levels, heavy metals, and so much more. Okay, so let's go through the RDA for potassium now that we know what it does in the body, that our kidneys are regulating it. When it comes to the recommended daily allowance for potassium, there's actually not one. And I talked about this a little bit last week because obviously we have an RDA for sodium. We don't have an RDA for potassium. It's called an adequate intake instead because there isn't enough scientific data to support one. At least that's what it means when a nutrient is assigned an adequate intake instead of an RDA. So it's basically going through an average daily level of intake that's sufficient to meet the nutrient requirements of nearly all 97 to 98% healthy individuals. And this is often used for like nutrition plans and stuff like that, like a more clinical setting. But the adequate intake recommendation for potassium for women is 2,600 milligrams for healthy women. It does increase to 2,900 milligrams for pregnant women, and then 2,800 milligrams for lactation. And then for men, it is 3,400 milligrams a day of potassium. The World Health Organization recommends consuming at least 3,500 milligrams per day, which I thought was interesting. It used to be 4,700 milligrams was the adequate intake recommendation. And then they kept lowering it, and now it's down to 2,600 milligrams. And a lot of the reason for this, from what I've read, it seems that it is related to trying to make it more realistic, since I think it's like 98% of the US population doesn't meet the recommended amount of potassium in their diet, which I'm like, not shocking. And so what happens is that since the potassium intake is lower and usually the sodium intake is higher from processed foods, you're going to have a really skewed sodium potassium ratio, which can lead to things like more fluid retention, higher blood pressure, all that kind of stuff. So I do understand where the concern is when it comes to like sodium and blood pressure, but I think a lot of it, the issue is that we're not getting enough potassium in, and now we're not really recommended to take in more. So I'm like, what incentive do people have? And then if we break it, I did have a note on, I thought this was interesting because a lot of people ask me about kids and they're like, how much is recommended for kids? Again, it's still adequate intake. It's not an RDA, but from birth to 6 months, it's 400 milligrams. From 7 to 12 months, it's 860 milligrams. And then from 1 to 2 years, it's 2,000 milligrams. From 4 to 8 years, it's 2,300. And then as they get like 9 and above, it's like 2,300 for women, and then it goes up higher and higher to the 2,600. And for men or boys, it's 2,500, and then it goes up to the 3,000 and the 3,400 milligrams. So used to be 4,700 milligrams, keeps going down. The 4,700 was recommended because that's what research showed it took to increase deficient potassium levels. And I would say that most people probably have deficient potassium levels and could benefit from this mineral. And so even if you may not be getting close to the 2,600, but I would say, don't use that as like your cap. And while getting that adequate potassium in your diet is important, we do want to make sure the ratio of sodium potassium is good. I think, last week I talked about how a 4-to-1 ratio of potassium to sodium is optimal, but honestly, I've seen even 3-to-1 be super effective for people, and everyone is different. Right? Everyone's going to be a little different with what they do best with. But I would say most often people really benefit from increasing their potassium intake through food. And a little historical note, because I did talk about like how low sodium, the really low sodium intake that hunter-gatherers most likely had, it was like 600 to 800 milligrams a day. And their potassium intake was estimated to be much higher. It was estimated to be from 5,850 milligrams to 11,310 milligrams per day. And, it makes sense kind of depending on what they were eating, because there's even potassium in meat and seafood and stuff like that. There can be actually a lot in that. So it's in a wide range of foods. I don't think it's impossible to get a lot of potassium, but I think if you're not focusing on it, especially with carbohydrates, it can be an easy one to overlook and then miss. And then a couple interesting adequate intake recommendations for other things would be like for hypertension, the recommended intake for potassium is 3,500 milligrams per day. And I would just, again, like I'm sure that there's data to support this, but I would say like any increase in potassium that you're currently eating, if you have more, you're likely going to see an improvement. But they especially saw improvements in systolic blood pressure. And the other thing is that potassium can allow our cerebral arteries of the brain to carry blood at high pressure without damage. And this is important because a lot of the times we're talking about high blood pressure in this population that struggles with high blood pressure and the concerns around that. A big part of that is that they are at a higher risk of stroke, and especially if we add diabetes to that picture. So increasing potassium intake could reduce that risk for stroke, which I thought was really interesting. So the RDA for hypertension, high blood pressure, 3,500 milligrams per day. Again, even if you increase by like 1,000 milligrams, you'll probably see some improvement there. And then just knowing down the road that this also is protective against stroke, I thought was very interesting. And if anyone has like comorbidities of like diabetes, then I would say you really want to work on your potassium intake, because insulin helps keep it inside the cell. And if you don't have great insulin levels, then you probably have depleted potassium. And there are studies that I linked on that. And we'll talk about that more, the blood sugar piece. And then just like that final reminder, because I did get some questions even after last week with sodium. Potassium regulates sodium, and sodium can impact our potassium levels. So if we have low potassium intake, we're going to increase how much sodium we're retaining. So low potassium equals high sodium. If we have adequate potassium intake, or if we increase our potassium intake, then we're going to increase how much sodium is being excreted from the body. And because we're excreting that sodium, it equals lower blood pressure. Or if someone's like salt sensitive, then it usually gets rid of any salt sensitivity issues. So potassium and sodium, very close relationship. And like I mentioned previously, like I got a question that I wanted to make sure I covered with potassium in the kidneys. And it is a concern to have like, am I going to get kidney damage? Unless you have chronic kidney failure, you're fine. But potassium can actually decrease the risk of kidney stones. And I wanted to mention that because that is a concern a lot of people have. And there's a lot of potassium-rich foods that are higher in oxalates. And people always, give me crap about that on Instagram. I'm like, just cook the foods and they'll have less oxalates. Or don't worry about oxalates. Can't wait to see the YouTube comments after saying that. But if we increase potassium-rich food intake, it decreases our risk of kidney stones. And there's certain types of potassium supplements that doctors will even use to reduce kidney stones. So it's just one of those tricky things. It's like there's so many benefits with the potassium and the kidneys and blood pressure, but also like if you're taking medication or have a specific health history, then like you need to be careful with your intake. But again, just focus on food and I think we'll be okay.